Live now. We're good. We are in discussion about artificial intelligence and machine learning, budgeting for the upcoming AI projects, machine learning projects, and XGen AI is here to help. So XGen AI here is to get the dialogue going, right? So welcome to Roundtable Discussion Part Two.
Yeah, no,
Now,
glad to be here also. Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking forward to having this discussion. If anything, it's sometime, I'll tell you this. I mean, it helps me learn when I say things out loud. It's hearing your own echo.
that's right.
And the other thing that I really look forward to is for our listeners to put comments and questions on. What I call a reinforced learning model for me. I mean, I learn from that too. So I think, simply put, it's a win-win situation. So glad to be here. It's Wednesday, beautiful day out there in Dallas today. So looking forward to see how this discussion goes.
So now, as if you're the reinforcement learning, I'm more like a supervised learning. I need you to supervise me as you do your reinforcement learning.
We got two models
Just
already
some
working.
machine learning jokes right there, right?
There you go. Two models already working.
Two
Yes.
models.
Yeah,
One is kind of working,
that's right.
but actually, that that first part, you hear yourself and you learn about yourself and what you're saying and how to correct yourself. That's AI, but that's also the human, right? But one of the things that I know you have been doing is just talking about these topics nonstop. That's what makes you the authority here to, speak on these topics because you've worked with multiple AI solutions, multiple cloud system. Your AWS cloud experience is well, I cannot even figure out the depth of it, right? And you've been with PwC, Accenture, Deloitte, all the consulting firms, DoD specifically for 14 years. Just impressive background. So when you talk, people listen, and I've definitely listened to you. That's why I'm here, because as you speak, you're able to not just say this is an idea, but how do we do the MLOps piece of it? How do we create a solution that has a project life cycle that we can see upfront and develop it as we go and understand where it is that we're falling off and where it is we're climbing up, right? So all of these matters because they all cost money, right? You have the human capital aspect of it. You have your labor cost. You have manpower, man hours, all these calculations that you have to do in the project. We have been really, as far as I think majority of the organizations have been very comfortable handing off the project to somebody else and say, you go do it, right? But I think that tide is shifting at this point is to say, well, yes, you can, but do you really want to? Think about the cost, right? Handing off to somebody versus doing it yourself is a two different outcome. At what point do you actually hand it off to somebody else is another outcome. And if you just rely fully on somebody, but you take over that product in the production environment, different outcome, right? So I think the cost is something that doesn't bother a whole lot of people because the whole workforce doesn't see that cost structure, but the CFOs do. And when we see the hesitancy in adoption of AI machine learning, that's where we have to target, hit those people that has the number in their mind, the budgeting in their mind, and say, look, the rest of the workforce might not see the way you see it, but here it is, right? We are here to help you to understand that the cost of it does not only have to be minimized, but effective enough that you can scale it over time and sustain that budget over time, right? So I think you've heard that way too many times. I'm just bringing it up to the surface for everybody else to listen, right?
Yeah.
So I think we discussed this last week, same thing, but again, I want you to introduce yourself again for that new light of information because everybody knows you're a techie, everybody knows how expert you are, but tell us a little bit more about that. What has been your experience like in project and financing this project?
Yeah, no, thank you, Asif. And I'm going to start back to your point earlier that you mentioned in terms of my own technical prowesses. I'll tell you, I've been humble. There are very smart people around. They're smarter, a lot smarter than I am. But I do, if you will, sometimes you gotta kind of what I call pat yourself on the shoulder. I do tend to have a personality that is willing to learn. At least I can make a claim on that. But really, I mean, a lot of the people around me are smarter people, and that's I've been fortunate to have that circle where I can learn from them, and that opportunity is obviously invaluable, right? You can't put a price on that. In terms of like your point, you got to look at the driving factors. What are the key drivers? Why would people care, right? It's the finance piece comes ultimately when you get to that point. But some of the key drivers why people are now start to explore this route of like, why do I have to send it out? Why can I keep it? Is multifaceted, right? One is now you have Moore's law obviously is in effect, so things are cheaper, right? Computes and this, that, and the other. You can get on cloud and you can get that. But the second most fundamental thing is that data ownership. And instead of companies saying, "Well, you can have access to my data," they want to own their own data. And there's a lot of there's power to that, right? Because that data is liquid gold. That's also driving toward the fact that is I can run it on my own. Now, obviously, the point is the scale, right? So how do you, I mean, do you have the scalability to run that on your own, or do you go outsource it? And there's a fine line, and that's where what I call the numbers game, right? That's where you got to understand: is it more capex heavy to go outsource it, or am I going to be burning candles from the both end when it comes to finances, or should I in-house it? Looking at your own resources and leveraging what you already have to then go and do certain computational analysis. But really, it's again, as I said, it's an avenue that's going to continue to grow as you get to see, again, as I mentioned, Moore's law kind of taking effects of full course, and it's going to just continue to sort of expand and come to a diminishing return at some point. But the fact that what's driving really is the data ownership is like I don't want to expose my data or myself, my corporation, to a third party that I have no clue of, and they want to own that data and they want to run that stuff, and then that boils down to the conversation of is it financially conducive to do it. But then going back to our earlier points on the other discussion is if it comes to it where you have to go and leverage third parties to do computations on your data, you have funding mechanisms available. But the problem again is working on these projects. I've found that a lot of the folks just don't know, and if you don't know, you just sometimes there's a bit of what I call I've noticed that too is people are shy of asking where say, hey, look, I mean, I don't know, tell me. And I've seen it firsthand. Perhaps I was guilty as charged from the beginning at some point too. But what I noticed is that curtain is slowly lifting, where people are now when I say people, C-level executives are now asking, what are the other mechanisms, especially in this cash-strapped economy, that they can leverage to do what they need to do to really kind of go to market. So there's a lot of mechanisms, there's a lot of funding mechanisms out there that the people like us need to educate our prospective clients on to say, hey, look, you're not alone in this. There's other ways that we can do this. I mean, I've done for multiple projects where clients said, hey, look, I don't have enough funds, and we said, let's work with the vendor. Vendor had used to offset some of the cost. And then there's some service credits as well, and this, that, and the other. And these CSPs, big CSPs, I mean, they continue to innovate and pass on savings to their customers. So there's a lot of programs, but you got to be in the know. You got to know where they are. You got to talk to these guys. You got to kind of like stay on top of it. And if you blink, or if you snooze, you lose, right? So that's the case there.
A flurry of thoughts coming into place, but I want to kind of adjust here, because when we say and encourage about AI, machine learning solutions, and say, let's adopt it and let's move forward with adoption, and then, watch it as it grows, there are vulnerabilities that I just cannot simply predict at this time, but I can look at the logistics and say, there's a choke point coming, right? So these kind of discussions let's say, for example, you spent a few hours on LinkedIn, nothing but positive things are coming up, right? As in, oh my God, look at all this technology. Yeah, I don't know if it's just my bubble that I live in with LinkedIn, or is everybody else is experiencing it, because I don't see other people's LinkedIn, but my feed is just full of AI. And the positivity is there, but there's people that has the industry experience that needs to come in and talk about what comes to logistics if there's a choke point. And we can dive into it, talk about it in another other episode. But financially, when you invest and you have that investment risk, that return on investment, how do you profit from it down the road, or how that one single event can knock you off the course? How do you do that vulnerability assessment? How do you do that disruption addressing, risk acceptance, risk management, or whatever that risk avoidance you have? There are a few things that the CIOs have to be aware of, right? Because what happened with last 10, 15 years of industry is to say, like, here's my baby project, please take care of it, right? And then deliver it when it's matured. For AI, I think the approach is similar, but we cannot get comfortable with that approach. What we have to do is understand our own maturity to it and our ability to take over that project, because this is not software. This is software plus plus, where you actually have to be very concerned with your reputational damage, your ability to deploy and maintain it and trigger, address topics that comes up as it goes, or actually have the due diligence ahead of time, so that way you have a checklist where you're able to say, we have addressed it, and the legal concerns that we will have down the road, this is how we will address that issue if the legal issue were to come up, or any other sort of issues that comes up through our due diligence, we can address that. And if you look at the industry right now, it has been that point that majority of the AI machine learning solutions, they don't deploy. And that's been the case for almost a decade at this point. But even today, the number is still there. Even the use cases have risen, right? But use cases as it arose, they're still not able to deploy that many tools. And percentage of the tools that does deploy, they underperform, right? They're not ready for an environment, actually, because the due diligence hasn't been done to say, like, once you do deploy, what sort of cost do you incur, and how do you deal with that cost, right? So I think a lot of the users, as they listen, they will say, have a one perspective, but when you talk to the CFO or a CIO that's looking at the quarterlies and looking at the 5-year life cycle, they will come to a different sort of conclusion, like, this is scary. There's a lot of positive to it, but I cannot address the future, and the future looks scary because of these concerns. So I think the solution, in my opinion, has always been MVPs and MLOps, right? Through an MLOps process, release the MVPs and work with the lowest hanging fruit, one that is the cheapest and the least riskiest, right? I've always said that. And I said, like, if you have, even 5-10 years ago, when we were discussing this topic, we talked about communication piece. That is the easiest one you can start with, the text. Large language model, ChatGPT, that large language model that helps you text-to-text communication. If you start there, you can expand beyond your wildest imagination, right? Your imagination of, like, how do you do text to video, low code, no code, right? You have all these capabilities that you can build on top of that. So you have foundation model, you have your large language model, but your foundation model is very important as well, because large language model is only a piece of that solution that you want to develop over time. So I don't mean to harp on this more. It's the idea is to don't keep up with Joneses, right?
Yeah.
Right.
No,
you're
you're right.
business logic, actually, and start from there. The cost incurs in your business logic, not with the Joneses, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to pause there and hear your thoughts on those.
No, I mean, I think again, you said it spot on in terms of the advent of AI and what it's doing in terms of disruption in the market. And yes, I mean, the feeds are, I get my phone's off the the hook as well. It's buzzing, like in terms of, because I have certain feeds that I look up and listen to. So I mean, the point that you mentioned about the MLOps, I mean, obviously people understand what that is, but not to get into the weeds, because I'll be the first one to tell you, I'm not a domain expert on MLOps, but we have people that actually I've been fortunate to work with and still working with, especially in part of our startup that this domain very well. But I go even further down, like you talked about, hey, look at, from an ROI perspective, what matter. I mean, again, if you compare, right, and we talked about this, like digression is, you got the DevOps piece, right, which is equivalent of the MLOps, because you're doing it in machine learning, and it's really bridging gap between data scientists and developers and then obviously there are other sort of covenants, if you will, under the MLOps. Now, if you look at the fundamentals of all of it, and it highlights one thing, right? It highlights what I call user training and upskilling. If people don't know, they don't know, and they can't use it effectively. As you remember, one of our good friends said, a fool with a tool is still a fool, right? It's the same methodology here. Is in order to realize the ROI, depending on what the objective is, if you put a tools or technology in place, you got to know how, you got to understand the people that are operating it. They need to know to then effectively realize the ROI. And then obviously, and then it goes into what is this trying to solve, what use case it's trying to solve, what market segment it's for, what particular industry it's for, which is, again, public information. Everybody knows it. They claim that they're expert at it. But really the basics of it is that, and I've seen it firsthand being a consultant, is you put a technology in place without thinking that, hey, there's a user community that needs to be trained to make sure that they use to this particular tool technology the best extent possible to then realize the ROI. And that's always been an afterthought. Same thing as training or change management. You go out and you deploy cloud solutions. Nobody thinks about, now things are changing, but back in the days, this was an afterthought. What about training? What about change management? None. It wasn't even part of the discussion. And now it's actually becoming, right, part of the discussion. So it's all about positioning yourself for success in terms of whatever use cases you're trying to solve with whatever tools and technology, but ensure that there's a proper upskilling, right, in place to realize the ROI.
Yeah, I think when you target a historical event like cloud, that adoption, even to this day, I think the latest number you mentioned is 53% of all corporations are in cloud at this point. There's 47 other % left, and I don't know who they are, but we need to talk to them. Maybe talk to them specifically about AI and how cloud can help, right? So I think if you look at it from the historical perspective, this AI perspective, the cloud perspective, the AI perspective based on cloud, if you have an educated user base, that is a good thing to have for product developers, right? Your educated users are able to do feedback and give you insights and make you develop that product for AI over time. It's sort of like, I deliver your MVP and the users are using it. That means users are able to interact in an educated manner and provide you with feedback, because say, for example, ChatGPT has a feedback option. How often do you click on the feedback option to say thumbs up or thumbs down, right? But if there was an educated user base that knew the importance of a thumbs up and thumbs down to improve ChatGPT experience, majority of the users would, right?
Gotcha.
But then ChatGPT can afford that not so educated user base, because ChatGPT is funded very well by Microsoft. Whereas in the other AI products, they really have to be concerned with this sort of feedback to say, what you're experiencing, I need you to help me understand what you're experiencing, so that way I can, create this product in a more efficient way, or better ways to help you better, right? But the other thing, I want to flip that, right? A educated user base is a nightmare for product developers. If you deliver
myopic thinking,
if you have delivered a bad product and you didn't put the maintenance and trigger piece of the system to say, as the users are experiencing it and my users are educated, they will burn your product down. And that's the truth, right? Because you've delivered a product that you didn't realize how educated your users are, how involved these users are. So you have risk on both sides, but upskilling, I cannot emphasize that enough, because for the last 7 years, since 2016, almost 8 years, 10 years now, that as I've been developing product, every product has just faced that one consequence over and over. As the users were not seeing what I was seeing, and I wasn't able to educate the user for them to see the product the way I was seeing it, right? Or at least have them understand that once I do deliver that product, how would they interact with that product, and how would that not only benefit them, it will benefit me, right? And in order to understand that feedback mechanism, that loop, is to understand how AI machine learning, the black box, works, right? That neural network piece, if that's necessary, or the transformers in the middle, how does that transformer work? These LSTMs, right? If they knew this little terminologies, they would actually say like, oh, okay, it's just like a brain. You have to tell the child, let's crawl first instead of running, because every time you run, you're going to fall flat on your face and bust your lips, right? So this kind of engagement with users, I think, are super important, even though they might get technical over time, but that's worth the risk, because more technical your users are, better these users are able to help you develop a better product, especially when it comes to writing a requirement. And so if you think about it from phase one, as in chapter 0, if your users are educated enough today, they can drive the requirements before you even spent a penny
That's right.
on developing this product.
That's right. That's right.
So in one side, you have a user base that is in the production side, and then the user base that is early on driving that ideation phase, that requirement gathering. Majority of the development that doesn't deploy has that issue, is that not enough people engaged with their educated business process understanding, subject matter expertise, or domain knowledge expertise to get together in the ideation phase to drive that development in a successful deployment.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that upskill up, because that's really exciting. That hypes me up a lot.
Yeah, no, it's a topic. I mean, as we're actually, so I mean, if you look at the trajectory from the times when, I mean, I was a C++ student when I started, back in high school or back in college, first year, learned C#, Java, C++, Pythons, and this, that, and the other. But look, I mean, at that time, these skills were like gold mines, right? You were top of the food chain in terms of making good income. But now you're actually in the economy where you heard terms, low code, no code. This whole prompt engineering is changing the paradigm. That's why you see a lot of tech layoffs happening as well, which is kind of sad. But at the same token, I mean, I don't want to digress, but at the same token, there's some rude awakening that's going to happen eventually for all these big corporations that are cutting. They're cutting so deep, they're actually cutting into the muscles. But that's a side discussion. But you're in an environment where you're looking at no code, low code, where a user doesn't need to know how to code to interact or to talk or to build, right? So this is a creator's economy. So if you have an idea, you can literally spend a little bit, invest a little bit of brain calories, and you can go build something. And from a technical perspective, and point you mentioned about understanding neural network and all that, you had a great webinar, I believe, a little while back for the Air Force, where you hold the sort of the what I call a memory lane, and you talked about neural networks and all that. That was a great discussion. I'd love for you to do that again for these audiences as well, because there's a lot of learning there. But really, I mean, again, historically speaking, people, it's good to have that knowledge, but you don't need to know how to code today. You can literally use prompts to build applications. For instance, you can get on custom chat GPT, you can get on Bedrock, Amazon Bedrock, Party Rock platform, and just tell it, the model, hey, I want to build this app, and it will walk you through just by doing prompts. People can argue 6 hours on Sunday that are experts in that domain saying, well, this, that. But the fact of the matter is, it's a tool, and you got to know how to use it. If you know how to use it best, it works. I created an app, personalized, a personalized education planner on Party Rock, and you've seen that, and you've seen when we did a field study as well, right? The results of that.
Yeah.
It didn't. I mean, trust me, I'll be the first one to admit. Now, I mean, I did code back in the days, but now I couldn't even save my life if I was to, right? So the fact those sort of niceties or these things are out there, and now it's shifting the economy and the mindset. The more educated you are on these tools and technologies, the better position you are for success, right? And I want to go back to a point you mentioned about it's a very, I mean, you talked about an educated user can destroy the product too. You're spot on that thought process. There's a very fine balance, but what I say is, you got to have an educated user, or you got to have an educated buyer, because if they're not engaged, then you absolutely should expect that your product's going to get obliterated.
That's right.
Right. So there's an aspect of involving user community to say, hey, I'm doing this. Does that actually fit the use cases or the narrative? Forget about the narrative, but the use cases that you're trying to solve. And the early feedback you get, the better your product will be when you hit to the market. So to me, having educated buyer or users or guests, it's important, right? It's a win-win situation.
I want to talk specifically because about the startups, and I think this is a good transition, because you brought up Bedrock and educated user base, and we're discussing this topic because when you think of Bedrock, That's that $0 cost startup right there, right? I mean, if you just know Bedrock and you've been a Cobalt developer 50 years ago, right? If you use ChatGPT, Bedrock, low code, no code, all of a sudden you can take your Cobalt into Java and Java to Python, right?
That's right.
That transition could happen
Yep.
with that, right?
That's right. That's
I
right.
mean, when COVID started, one of those stories that I love talking about is that the retirees for Cobalt developers, they had to come back to the workforce for $400, $500 an hour,
An hour. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
were charging out the, you know what I mean?
They
And
couldn't find Cobalt developers. I
they
remember
couldn't
because
find Cobalt
I was
developers.
in defense at the time. They couldn't even, I was working on a project with defense. They couldn't find Cobalt developer. We had
And
like requisitions out there, like, hey, with the flag, anybody with Cobalt? And they were charging their own rates.
and today, how do you deal with Cobalt? You get on Chat GPT, and if you want to develop what you had on Cobalt as an app, now you want to develop in a Bedrock, your cost would be to do the Cobalt development in Chat GPT or something like that.
Yeah.
What, like, let's call it a few $100s, and then a Bedrock is like $0. But in order to scale and sustain, you have to spend some money on it. But it's not even that much, because if you're thinking about startup back in days versus startup today, I think that's the mindset you have to have. That if you are going about the old ways of spending just a bunch of money and trying to get a product up, you are already doing it wrong, right?
Yeah.
What you have to do is create that product, take it to the market, educate the user, and see how an educated user interacts different versus the non-educated user. As in, I'll call them the still to be educated users, right?
Yes.
See the interactions.
Yeah.
And it costed you $0 other than your time, and you
Yes.
take that to the market. Like, I think you did that in the public, right? You took it to public. You're like, hey, I have this app. Would you mind checking it out?
Yeah.
It was that simple. If
That's it.
you are developing a product today and you're doing it any other way, I
Yeah.
would doubt you. I would say, like, no, you don't need to go to the VCs. You don't need to go get angel investors to invest on your product, because your product can start here. Right?
And I want to jump in and
that you put it together. It's insane how little it cost.
You get me excited over. That's why I want to jump in, and my apologies speaking over. But the part of that study was actually going to a field study as well. I went to school first. I asked some questions from the counselors and this, that, and the other, and then I went to students. I asked some questions, and then I actually built the app and went to a cafeteria and sat there and asked students to go try it. It actually helps. I mean, those field studies are important because they tell you if this is going to survive or not. Now, to your other point, I mean, again, in terms of cost, right? It is so important to realize that there's two aspects. One, the automation. Automation to start off is not going to be free. There may be an uptake in terms of price, right? Because once you put the enablement, the first step is always the one that you're going to have to see sort of like a bulk of investments that need to be made. But once the overtime maturity, right, is you're going to start to see the capex swing down, right, and then you're going to have an opex coming up. So one other thing that it's my own learning. Like, to your point, to run a query on ChatGPT 4, it costs you about 4 cents, 4 pennies. And that is if you run a complex query with what I call rendering. So think of this, I created this workflow in Zapier to do a LinkedIn post where it's all automated, right? So I'm telling you, hey, these are sort of the steps in Zapier defined. I said, use these 3 things. Start out with, scheduler, then go with ChatGPT to generate the posting, and then, go to LinkedIn, post it. These 3 things. For me to do that, it took me about, let's say, good 40 minutes to an hour. Now, people that have been using it, it's going to take them a lot less than that. But I was learning. It took me about an hour to then deploy that and put a post out there. It cost me 4 cents. Imagine if this automation wasn't there. You need to find people that have content development skills. You need to find people that have kind of idea on putting on LinkedIn, social media experts. And when you hire them, there's a what I call warm up period. So you actually incurring cost by putting them on the seat by hiring. Yet nothing's been produced, right? Because they're getting onboarded, they're getting warmed up. And by the time they do their first post, you already spent whatever number that is. I haven't done the math, but you already spent a couple of grand, if any, right, for the first week. Here, for 4 cents, you do it in less than an hour, and you have it, right? So it's sort of like what I call there's a big moment of reckoning that's going to happen with this automation that's coming. And a lot of the, I mean, this is the other step that you got to understand. Like a lot of the user communities, or let's kind of go even further out there, like make it broader. So if you look at Chat GPT today, I think you and I had a very intimate conversation on this. Is, I want to look for a plugin custom Chat GPT. I go look at the plugins randomly just to kind of look at my. Well, what I do is I try to figure out what's the top most used. I mean, and that gives me what I call a gauge into how many people are actually interacting with the platform. Sure, the Chat GPT itself, millions of users, but look at the plugins that Chat GPT created. And I'm looking at literally, for instance, take an example for what I would say is they created a plugin. Man, I'm losing my mind here. But anyway, one of the top most plugin that they created, it wasn't Dolly, it was something else that they were. Maybe I'll share that with you in the chat, and you can share with the user. But the top most plugin created by ChatGPT for productivity tool, the hits were on that less than 20K. What that means is people don't even know that there are plugins out there to make their life easy. Right? Is there's such a vast, I mean, that's why you see, I mean, there's a lot of apps out there, but they're kind of sitting in the sort of a dormant room. But eventually the curtain's gonna lift, right? And all of these things are gonna come to bear, even though and you start kind of going down like the list of plugins that are out there. So you have a 20K, then immediately the next one would be like 10K, then the next one would be 300, the next one would be 2 or 8. It's like people don't even go beyond like 1 or 2 plugins. Because why? The reason I'm saying that is because they're not educated on this technology. Yeah. People need to know how to use these, because I'm telling you, what I just gave you an example from putting a post on LinkedIn in less than 4 minutes. I mean, that's the automation I'm talking about. That's what ChatGPT is for, is to make you more efficient and grant you what I call abundance of time, so that you can focus on more productivity.
I've been laughing the whole time because I've been just thinking about like what happens to me when I go to buffet these days, right? I go to buffet and the first thing I think about is you. Said Nasir has this great way of explaining what happens if you go to a buffet and eat just whatever comes in front of you, right? If you do that, you end up so full that you don't end up picking the right best dishes in the buffet line, right? So that's what happened with ChatGPT users. They got so full with the buffet and ChatGPT, they forgot the main thing, the app store, the ingredients that makes ChatGPT look like what gold premium thing, right? Like ChatGPT is just like a regular buffet, and then you got the special dishes that you forgot about. There's only 20K users for those.
That's right.
I think that's a great analogy for every industry out there that's looking at ChatGPT or large language model or AI and thinking, well, that's all there is. But you don't know this other side of equation where that's the gold, because you have to kind of conserve yourself when you go to the buffet line or IT line or product support line or product development line and say, no, this is the one. Okay, no, this is the one. I'm not going to fill up on all the other stuff. I'm just going to eat these, right? Great analogy. And I love it. Every time I go to buffet now, I'm like, yeah, I got to figure out what nuts you're doing.
Yeah, there's another funny story that you and I went through. I mean, again, I think I told you guys, is like we met a CEO who bought in XYZ company, but the ChatGPT plugins, they do it for free. So they spend about several $1 million buying the product, and here's ChatGPT that's plugin that's doing it for free. So it's like a deer in the headlight look. I mean, you're gonna have those moments. That is why it's so important to like look at the lay of the land, study like what's out there available. Right. What can you do? I mean, with the things that are there. And honestly, I mean, again, the more you're aware, you can contain what I call blast radius when it comes to depleting your funds. And again, it's all sorts of things coming back full circle, as you have funding mechanisms available through third-party vendors or the vendors you interact with or the CSPs or the GSIs. If you're working with the integrators, they have fundings to help you as a customer get through, bring you the automation, right? And you just got to know. And then same thing, the tools and technology are out there. If you're looking for it, you'll find them. And if not, AXEGENAI can always help you.
AXEGENAI is always there, and AXEGENAI is going to do the live webinar every week, and we're going to re-release these recordings so you can watch it another time. But if you catch us live, or even if you don't catch us live, go ahead and put your questions in the comment sections. we can get directly to you on your inbox. We'll definitely keep an eye out for comments. Because any questions you ask, it helps us to formulate our own thought process behind it. Because not all questions do we have answers to readily available, but every time you ask questions, we learn something new. So feel free to ask us those questions. It doesn't have to be necessarily about AI machine learning. Just think about it from a project lifecycle, cost benefit analysis. You can look at it from the startup perspectives. We love military veterans in this AXEGENAI because we both work in DoD space. 14 years for you, 18 years for me. I think when we look at the use cases and the questions, we need to find questions on the use case that maps together. And the problems that we have right now, we have thousands of use cases. I mean, we literally listed use cases the other day that came close to 1,000 actually.
Yeah.
And what we need is a question at this point to say, how do you map each of these use cases to the questions that you're asking, right? So any questions that you guys ask, we'll look up a use case and get it to you as soon as we can. So feel free to drop your comments in the comment section below. And until next week, Naz and Asif, we are out, and we'll see you guys next week. Thank you.
Thank you all.